Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School, to all of you and to those of you that are in the overflow and online. We're absolutely delighted this evening to have with us not only the Chancellor, but also Lillian Martin and many guests. Welcome particularly to you. Tonight is the first in an annual series of memorial lectures for James Martin, who tragically died just over a year ago. And we're absolutely delighted to have on this occasion the Chancellor of the University to deliver the lecture. The Chancellor, in addition to having been, over the last years, the head of our university, the chairman of it in many people's terms, has done so many other things over his long career. He was originally at Oxford at Balliol College, which I think was the first of his many wise decisions as a Balliol person myself. Apologies to those who might not agree with that particular point. And then went on to join the research department of the Conservative Party, being its youngest ever director, a post he held until 1979. 35 years ago, he was elected to Parliament and has held extremely wide range of positions. I first saw him when I went into the offices of the then aid agency, which now Difford. And if you go into Difford on Whitehall, you will see a very young-looking Chancellor on the wall in the proud line of Secretaries of State for Development. He was also the Secretary of State for the Environment, Minister of State for Education and Science, Secretary of State in the Northern Ireland Office, and of course then in November 1990 he became chairman of the Conservative Party before going on to become the last imperial governor of Hong Kong, a post he relinquished with great effect 17 years ago. He then went on to be chairman of the Independent Commission on Policing for Northern Ireland, set up after the Good Friday Peace Agreement, and then, as if that was not enough, to be the European Commissioner for External Relations, and then taking up a seat in the House of Lords. The best, of course, and maybe he had to do penance for all these other wonderful jobs, was still to come, becoming chairman of the BBC Trust. He's now, having stepped down from that, the chair of a committee established by Pope Francis on the Vatican media, which I'm sure will be slightly easier than the BBC. In addition to these many other tasks, he's written a number of books. I particularly commend to you What Next? Surviving the 21st Century, which I know inspired James Martin as it does me. His other books are Not Quite the Diplomat, Home Truths About World Affairs, and East and West. He was a member of the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations and played an enormously important role in helping us think about how to deal with the big challenges of global governments. It's with great pleasure that I give him the floor to address us on Gridlock and Train Smashers, what happens when the world loses the habit of cooperation. Chancellor.
Lillian, Ian, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be asked to give the first Martin lecture. It honours the memory of a great man who was a prodigious, generous benefactor of Oxford University. It's no exaggeration to say that James was a man whose visionary philanthropy has been rarely equalled in all the centuries of our history. And I'm delighted that Lillian is with us today, who is also a generous supporter of the university. James Martin's hope was that over the years, over the decades to come, the work of the school that bears his name would, through its scholarship, make the world a better place, ensuring that its citizens could live in peaceful and prosperous harmony with our planet. And the challenge for the Martin School, the challenge for the university, is to prove that he was right in that aspiration. Listening to my obituary a moment or two ago, I was reminded that one of the first people I worked for when I came into politics was Lord Carrington, who had a habit after you'd set out for him some imponderable problem, like how can we make the Conservative Party look rather nicer, would respond, he would lean back in his seat and say rather laconically, after you'd explained the dimensions of the problem, and so. And it planted the seed of a prejudice which grew over the years, a prejudice which I discovered later on. I shared with my friend, the former Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans. We both disliked intensely people who would come to see us when we were ministers or in similar jobs, well-meaning NGOs, commentators, fellow politicians, journalists, and set out for us appallingly difficult problems and say at the end, as it were, in capital letters, something must be done. And both Gareth and I always felt that it would have been helpful if they'd just given us an indication of what the something might be. We both worked for a time at a think tank which was as good as any, I guess, in analysing the prospect of conflict and crisis and proposing very practical ways in which the parties that might be drawn into those conflicts could do something about them, the International Crisis Group. So we tried to practice what we'd both felt strongly about over the years. And it was in something of that spirit that I wrote, and Ian was very kind to refer to this, that I wrote a few years ago a book called What Next? I sent it to my then opposite number, His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, who was Chancellor then of Cambridge University, and he sent back a very courteous reply in his own hand saying, "What next?" He said, "When you're my age, there's only one answer." What I tried to do in that book was to show how individual nation states are faced by problems that have a global impact, problems which don't know an international boundary when they get to it, problems that can only be dealt with by greater international cooperation. And I suggested across the board specific ways in which some of those problems could be addressed: resource conflicts, environmental degradation, nuclear proliferation, health epidemics, and so on. When trying to market the book, I was invited to a meeting of the sales staff of Penguin Allen Lane. And I set out what I thought the book was all about. And then one of the salesmen said to me, "Could you just tell us in a sentence what the book's all about? Could you just tell us what your plan for the world is?" And I stumbled through an explanation of how I'd always thought that it was much easier to talk about getting from A to Z than actually getting from A to B. And I saw his eyes glaze over as I declined to give him my vision for the world and declined to go much beyond arguing that what we should be trying to do is to muddle through rather more effectively than we do at present. But actually, I think that my analysis goes rather further than that. And I think it's based not just on a sense that, as Oakeshott said, life is a predicament, but it's based on the affirmation of belief in some rather basic values which we often associate with the Enlightenment. The first is a belief in our common humanity. The second is a belief that we should be able to use our reason to sift through evidence in order to try to find answers to the problems that confront us and better ways of doing things. I'm not a great believer in faith-based policy. I think faith is a matter for churches, not parliaments. And it was a belief as well that we should reject two propositions that are often put forward these days. The first I've referred to. The first is the notion that international institutions are bound to fall flat on their face as soon as they hit a national border. And the second is that international intervention can never be justified in the affairs of nation states, whatever the alleged legal base for that intervention. Well, to use the contemporary cliché or cliché, as Ernie Bevan used to call them, to use the conventional cliché, that is where I'm coming from. All this perhaps explains why I found the report of the Martin Commission under my old colleague Pascal Lamy such a convincing and such a helpful document. It not only sets out in a very readable way the challenges that face us in the 21st century, but actually suggests some very practical ways of trying to overcome those challenges, drawing from time to time on what we've done in the past, which has been successful. I think we have to ask ourselves, why, given that, it seems so difficult to make more progress on the sort of issues which are covered in the report? Have we lost any sense of reason and evidence-based policy these days? Has there been some diminution in our sense of common humanity? How did we get here? In his wonderful history of post-war Europe, Tony Judt referred to the 50 years in Europe after the Second World War as the epilogue years. He said those were the years in which our global politics and global institutions were shaped by the experiences and outcome of two world wars. Well, the outcome was eventually successful. We created a different world, and we now live, I suppose, in either a long footnote to the epilogue years, or perhaps we've started on the first paragraph or chapter of a new draft of history. Are the old ways over? Is there something that is clearly going to take the place of that old world? There's certainly nothing in sight at the moment. The post-war order was dominated by the Atlantic community and its economic and political values. And America, which had been at the heart of the combination which helped to win the Second World War, America was at the heart of that work of creation as well. It drove forward the security agenda based in Europe on NATO. NATO, which was described by its first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, as designed to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. The Americans drove the reconstruction of a ravaged and ransacked Europe, first of all with the extraordinarily generous provision of Marshall aid, secondly with the pressure that the Americans put on Europe to get away from the sort of xenophobic nationalism which had produced the First and Second World Wars. It's sometimes argued that NATO was the Americans' idea and the common market was Europeans' idea. It's not strictly true. Europe pressed America very hard to stay attached to Europe in security terms after the Second World War. And part of the price that America drove was that the Europeans should learn to live rather better and more peacefully together and not once again require American soldiers to come to Europe to die for Europeans. The result was hugely successful. It wasn't only France that enjoyed what the French themselves in a famous book called the Trente Glorieuses. It was America that drove the spread of economic freedom with GATT and so on, and political pluralism. Not always a smooth process, with too many wars fought as surrogates of the Cold War, from Vietnam to the Congo, but nevertheless, and not always done with great sophistication, it has to be said, and it's not only Graham Greene who thought that, but it did end, let's face it, with the Cold War being brought to a close without any fighting, at least in Europe. And it also ended with the beginning of the economic ascent of the world's largest countries, persuaded by the failures of their own existing systems and by self-advantage to join the global economy. The high point in that process, coming after the fall of the Berlin Wall, was celebrated by Francis Fukuyama in the early 1990s with a book whose title he must now deeply regret, called The End of History, in which, to be fair to him, he was not suggesting that we'd finished with interesting times, but that the economic and political model, the liberal economic and political model, which had been protected, safeguarded, advanced by the Atlantic community in the previous few years, had finally triumphed. So what happened? Well, we turned the page on a new century, which was marked by a terrorist assault on New York, funded, perhaps suitably enough, by credit cards. And since then, the whole system that we'd taken for granted seems to have fractured. The United Nations authority is in decline. We have a world order whose principal architect is increasingly unwilling to take responsibility for sustaining it. We have a world order which the largest emerging Asian power seems unwilling to accept, and into which it doesn't seem prepared to integrate. So how has the whole system of global cooperation led by the West fallen to pieces? Can it be put back together again? Should we want to put it back together again? Let me say a few words about the principal actors in this drama. For almost 140 years, the United States, with 4 to 5% of the world's population, has been responsible for 20, even as high as 40% of the world's output. It's the only large, developed, democratic society whose population is likely to increase substantially over the first half of this century, predicted to increase by about 100 million. It's true that the United States' share of global income has fallen pretty substantially. When I first visited the United States on a Balliol scholarship in 1965, America represented between 37 and 38% of global income. That figure is about 20% today. And it's true that in terms of GDP, the United States will shortly be overtaken by China. But China, in terms of per capita national income, is only about 20% of the way to America's position. And the demographers and economists predict that China is likely to get old before it gets rich. Moreover, it's interesting, a point to which I'll return, how little soft power China has, and how much, except in economic terms, it punches below its weight. Exactly the reverse of the situation with the United States. The United States is the only country that matters everywhere. The United States spends as much on defense as the next 10 big spenders put together. And America has an extraordinarily vibrant economy, partly because it combines receptiveness to immigration, a great university system, and a culture of innovation. Perhaps there are lessons for the United Kingdom government and Mrs. May in all that. Jeremiads about US decline are a feature of US culture. But there are three issues, which I think inhibit in America the ability or willingness to continue to give the sort of global leadership to which we became accustomed. The first is the dysfunctionality of America's political system. It has more checks than balances, partly a consequence of a constitution designed to prevent the emergence of an American monarch like George III. But perhaps they won that battle some time ago. A third of all Americans live in the 10 most populous states, which together account for only 20 out of 100 Senate seats. And of course, the House of Representatives is disfigured by gerrymandering. Those issues together help to make it more difficult to break the partisan gridlock which at present exists in Washington. The second issue I want to mention very briefly is that the middle class which America built up in the decades, the 20 or 30 years after the Second World War, has been hollowed out since the 1980s, with the squeeze on middle class remuneration, with the growth on domestic debt partly to make up for that squeeze in remuneration, and with a growing gap between the richest and the rest. The last 25 years, the top 1% of earners in the United States have seen their share of national income treble. The income of middle classes has gone up by only 20%, and the income of those at the bottom has stayed flat. By the time of the housing and banking crash in 2007, 2008, the top 1% in America owned 40% of the nation's wealth. The bottom 4/5 owned just 7%. This growing inequality and financial pressure on the middle class has led to what the New Yorker journalist George Packer has called a great unwinding in America. And it certainly helped to produce a loss of self-confidence in American society. The third issue which has obviously affected America's ability to lead is that its policy abroad has zigzagged between the hubris of the unipolar hour, Mr. Cheney and the second Mr. Bush, the belief in those days that you could, if you were powerful enough, create your own reality. You've come from that to the nervousness about any sort of intervention in the world at all. There's been a long and bloody road between Kabul and Baghdad in the early 2000s and what's happening in the same places today, what's happening in West Asia as a whole, what's happening in the Sahel, what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere. In the course of that journey, in which so much blood and treasure was spilt into what Winston Churchill called the thankless deserts of Mesopotamia, in the course of that journey, what are the questions about international politics and America's role which have gone unanswered, or have been answered incoherently, or have been answered contradictorily? First, what are the limits, even for a great power, of sovereignty? To what extent does America still believe that individual citizens have rights as well as states, the proposition advanced by Kofi Annan, by Bernard Kouchner, and in a slightly cruder way by Tony Blair, brackets, St. John's, close brackets. Is it legitimate for the international community to intervene in states in order to protect the human rights of their citizens? Secondly, a proposition, incidentally, which the UN accepted in 2005 with the so-called principle of responsibility to protect, a principle on which they've subsequently shown extremely cold feet. Secondly, is the pursuit of the national interest different from or related to our concern about human rights? Do human rights and the national interest reinforce one another, or do they tug in different directions? Do you always need the sanction of the UN to go to war? And how can you get that given the present composition of the UN Security Council? What should the United States do about threats that the rest of the world ignores or seeks to pretend away? Can you try to impose democracy by force? How much can you achieve with hard power, and how much by soft power, and what exactly is soft power? Is a dictatorship that you know and support, Egypt, for example, better than the anarchy you fear may follow its fall? Does the globalization of our awareness of horror and outrage through the ubiquity of the contemporary media make it easier or harder to mobilize consent for action and sacrifice beyond our own national borders? And finally, for Americans, is the most powerful country in the world, is it able to use that strength to get the answers to these questions, always supposing, of course, that it knows what those answers should be? And in those circumstances, if it does know what the answers are, is it able to organize the consent domestically that it could enable it to do anything at all about those questions? Americans used to believe, with some justification, that they could turn to Europe to help answer these questions, and we used to take the view that we were particularly sophisticated in providing those answers. Harold Macmillan, Greece to their Rome, leave aside the fact that the Greeks were slaves. How capable are we now of helping America sort out those problems and help America deal with them? The analysis of Europe's problems at the moment can lead to a sense of catatonic gloom. I don't think we should allow that to happen. First of all, plainly in Europe, we have a considerable degree of political stability. When I first came into politics, half of Europe was still part of the Russian Empire, and there were 3 countries in Europe, yes, just, which were governed by military dictatorships. Well, today we have Jobbik and Mr. Farage to worry about, but not quite perhaps as menacing. We have the highest quality of life, I think it's still true to say, pretty well in the world, and we have a pretty good standard of living. Just looking at economic issues, we've actually done better than either Japan or the United States in protecting our share of global trade as the emerging markets have risen so spectacularly in the last few years. But we do face a catalogue of challenges, some of them, most of them, homemade. I think it's possible, very easy to exaggerate them, as one New York Times commentator did recently. He's actually a Balliol man, comparing Europe as he did with the melancholy, sick, rich, even decadent society which is portrayed in that Fellini-like film by Paul Sorrentino, La Grande Bellezza. Europe's neither that glamorous nor that grotesque. But we do have considerable difficulties, not least breaking out of the triangle of figures, the iron triangle mentioned by Angela Merkel in her last election campaign, when she pointed out that Europe has about 7% of the world's population, between 20 and 25% of the world's output, but 50% of the world's spending on welfare. How can we remain competitive while sustaining the post-war social compact in Europe? How can we pay for the entitlement programs to which we think we are still entitled, to which we think we're entitled to receive, when paying for those seems to drive us into ever deeper debt? Are we prepared to face up to the implications of an aging population and, in many countries, a declining workforce? We are bad in Europe at combining high employment and high productivity. There's only one country in Europe which has both high employment and high productivity, and that is the Netherlands. All that's combined with the extent to which we focus so much political energy on a project, the success of the Eurozone, which seems to be disconnected from national parliaments and democratic accountability, which threatens to create a divided Europe between North and South, and which apparently depends on a model of economic management made in Berlin, which has produced in Germany since 2000 a growth rate of just 1% a year, which places Germany in the league table of growth since 2000, 12th out of 17 countries. A result, sorry, it's Berlin on the phone. A result of the present European travails is the growth of a dangerous populist right, and I guess if you ever listen to Mr. Brand, left, which democratic politicians can't fight, though they try to do so by trying to compromise with it. These populist parties in Greece, France, Italy, the Netherlands, the UK, Austria, Hungary, where the Prime Minister doesn't appear anymore to believe in liberal democracy, and even Sweden, share a Manichaean view of a world divided between us and them. They usually offer a political brew which is hostile to globalization, which is anti-immigrant, which is Islamophobic, which is chauvinist about welfare spending, and, more understandably, hostile to unemployment and to economic policies which are thought to have been imposed by Germany. Populist parties which believe in conspiracy theory, in a past of decent simplicities which rarely existed, and in the alleged corruption of present-day representative democratic politics. One of Europe's besetting sins is to combine navel-gazing, an obsession with some of our own domestic problems, with making loud rhetorical noises about our regional and global role, which are inevitably out of sync with what we're actually able to do or what we're prepared to do. If you take one indicator which is always referred to by Americans, who now provide the overwhelming amount of Europe's defense spending, European countries have, with 3 exceptions, failed to deliver on the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defense. The only 3 who meet that target are Greece, Estonia, and Britain. And Britain, within a couple of years, will have fallen below it. I can't remember who it was who described some European armed forces as like remarkably well-armed pension funds. But that is the truth of the matter. When NATO was established, the band was heard to be playing "I've Got Plenty of Nothing," and it may be perhaps more suitable to be played today. It is, of course, possible, in a way which I think the United States would find helpful, to construct a European foreign and security policy around some rather unglamorous but significant objectives which have been reasonably successful in the past. First of all, securing the stability around our borders. That's something which we secured with the most successful foreign policy that Europe has pursued, namely enlargement. It's of course relevant to the debate today, which I'll come back to, about Ukraine. We could be focused much more than we are on using our trade and economic cooperation to develop stability around the Mediterranean, though our still knee-jerk protectionism makes that more difficult in some of these southern European member states. And we could use our trade clout, our importance economically, if we were prepared to be more coherent in doing it, in our relations with China and India and Brazil and others. But at the moment, it has to be said that European foreign and security policy is pretty much what philosophers would call a category error. And while we have one of my Danish colleagues, when I was a commissioner, used to talk about the high representative for the lowest common denominator. And that's not a wholly unfair description of the situation we have today. I'm sure that the former Italian foreign minister will be very good at being the European Union's high representative, but she does need a policy to represent. So Europe isn't proving much assistance to the United States at the moment, and we can't expect much assistance from Russia or China, with Britain, France, and the United States, the other 2 permanent members of the Security Council. Russia seems to me to be bent on trying to implement a quasi-Tsarist dream of recreating something like Russia's European empire through the Eurasian Union, which is the focus of Mr. Putin's ambitions. And as for China, I think Chinese diplomacy is focused on 3 things very clearly. First of all, history. China wants to safeguard its territorial integrity and will often appeal to xenophobia in order to do that. Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, and so on. Secondly, China wants to promote its economic development, securing the national resources which are required for that development, and securing those resources in its supplier states and with the communications to those supplier states. And thirdly, and perhaps most important for the leadership, it wants to keep the Communist Party in power, which is one reason why the Chinese internal security budget is higher than the external security budget. I don't think that suggests that China is an economic model which others will want to follow, and it's quite interesting to tick off a list of China's best friends from North Korea to Venezuela to Zimbabwe. As for the institutions of the world order, I think China, like other emerging markets, is rightly critical of the Bretton Woods institutions, which were hopeless in adjusting to the change in balance in the global economy. But I think beyond that, they're mistaken in thinking that they can produce something better than the UN system, that they can produce something better than the other assumptions about the world economic order simply by pursuing whatever they think is in China's national interest. I think in order to secure even the aims which I've mentioned, it's important for China to understand the value of international cooperation, albeit that involves a good deal of pragmatism about sovereignty and burden sharing. So what are we to do only just over 20 years after George Bush Sr. Saw not unreasonably the prospect of a new world order? He thought that after a search lasting 1,000 years, we had found, in his words, the elusive path to peace. Well, we do have a new world order of sorts. It's a world in which we have returned to Westphalian politics, in which national interest clashes with national interest, in which the balance of power is pursued for specific national objectives, in which we've allowed theories of cooperation or the espousal of shared values to be put on the back burner, a world order in which we focus principally on allegedly hard-nosed issues of GDP growth or nationalist bluster. Still, of course, efforts are made, gallant efforts, to make the world a better, safer, more prosperous place through working better together. That's what we see with those who are at present trying to tackle the Ebola outbreak and other public health epidemics and issues. That's what I hope we will see after the midterm elections in the United States, with President Obama, we hope, recommitting himself to ensuring the security of the anti-nuclear proliferation regime by trying to reach a sensible accommodation with Iran. That's what we see with the dogged pursuit of the Millennium Development Goals and with the attempts to put some new life into international environmental diplomacy. That's what we see in some efforts, though not everywhere, to generate a more responsible and thoughtful debate about migration issues. It is, to go back to where I began, an example in all these areas of trying to muddle through rather better with dedication and gritted teeth and fingers crossed. But I want to single out, finally, 3 geostrategic crises where I don't believe that muddling through is sufficient. And I've chosen them all, one in particular, because of the fact that we're 100 years on from the crisis which led to the First World War, when, of course, we deluded ourselves in the summer of 1914 that we'd managed previous Balkans crises and could therefore find a way through the Balkans crisis in August 1914. It was a time as well when we also thought that globalization made the world so interdependent that war was unthinkable. Norman Angell, you may recall, wrote a best-selling book on how Britain and Germany could never go to war because we depended on one another economically so much. Well, the unthinkable, it might have been, but it wasn't in the event undoable. The first point which I want to raise telegrammatically is the clash between the Sunni and Shia in West Asia. I think it's understandable that many people think that that could turn into the 21st century's equivalent of the 17th century 30 Years' War. In Bertolt Brecht's great play about the 30 Years' War, Mother Courage and Her Children, one of the characters says, "You know what the trouble with peace is? No organization." So how would you organize peace in West Asia, in the Middle East today? It seemed to me that there are two essential conditions. The first is trying to get Saudi Arabia and Iran to understand how much they will suffer if the Sunni-Shia conflict simply continues. They are, as it were, the main intellectual, if not actually financial, sponsors on the two sides of that conflict. And I think they need to be involved in the diplomacy to end it. What makes that more complicated is that there is a longer-term issue as well, which was first identified by the UNDP in the early years of the century in a report written by Arabs for Arabs, in which its authors, led by a Jordanian woman minister, its authors pointed out that what had gone wrong in West Asia and North Africa was the lack of a connection between political freedom and economic freedom. And that is still an issue which has to be addressed in those countries. The second issue which I would touch on, which deeply worries me, is one which is covered by very often by people talking about the Thucydides trap. It's referred to particularly by those who've never read Thucydides, I suspect, and refers to the great historian's work on the 5th century war between Athens and Sparta. And the argument is that it demonstrated for the first time that a great power would never be happy to see the emergence of another power, and that that process would always lead to conflict. I don't think it's a very... And of course, people then go on to say that we saw that again in the 19th century and the 20th century with the rise of Germany and Britain and other powers feeling obliged to slap Germany down. So now they say America isn't going to allow the rise of China. It's inevitably going to lead to conflict. I think there are several things wrong with the thesis. First of all, it wasn't just in the 5th century BC a question of Sparta slapping down a rival power in Athens. There was also an issue of Athenian hubris and serious policy errors made by the Athenians. In the 19th and 20th centuries, while certainly Germany made some serious mistakes like building up its navy, which I think helped to provoke reactions from others, we went to war with Germany, but we didn't go to war with other emerging powers, the United States and Japan, for example. So I don't think there's any inevitability about a future Chinese-US conflict, despite the view which has been prevalent on the right wing of the Republican Party since the mid-1990s, that America's strategic doctrine should make sure that no rival emerges globally. I don't think we should attempt to contain China, but no one can ignore today the expansion of Chinese maritime power, purportedly to secure energy resources in the waters around its shores, and the effect that that has had on its neighbors like Vietnam and the Philippines. And of course, its largest neighbor, its largest foe, Japan. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that avoiding the political arguments between China and Japan tipping over into something much more serious is probably the nearest comparison we have to what happened 100 years ago in Europe. And look at the relationship between India and China and Japan. In his recent visit to Japan, Mr. Modi referred to some Asian powers behaving, he said, as though they were living in the 18th century. I think what he actually meant was the early 19th century, with the Monroe Doctrine and all that. China is helping to drive India into the arms of the Japanese, and it's worth recalling that when the Indians exploded their first nuclear device, the Minister of Defense at the time gave us the reason for doing that. Not worries about Pakistan, but worries about China. So I think managing the relationship with China, helping to prevent the incipient hostility between China and Japan from boiling over, is a major diplomatic strategic concern for the next few years. And I say that as somebody who recognizes how often the Japanese manage to provoke China unnecessarily by really foolish activities and foolish statements, whether about history or about present-day politics. The third major geopolitical issue which concerns me is one where Europe is absolutely in the front line, and that is how we cope with Mr. Putin and Mr. Putin's Russia. I will be very brief about this, but plainly Mr. Putin in the last few years has broken what has been a cardinal principle of security policy in Europe since the war, that you don't try to change frontiers by brute force. If you look at Chinese behavior in Moldova, in Transnistria, in Georgia, in South Ossetia, and in Abkhazia, and most recently in Crimea and the eastern Ukraine, where Russia has in effect invaded a country. If you look at those things, then it's, I think, plainly the case that Europe has to be much more robust in its response, not least by developing a single European energy policy, without which I don't think we'll be ever very successful in dealing with Russian revanchism. I'm sorry if all that sounds rather depressing. Charlie Brown, the common man in those wonderful Peanuts cartoons, says in one of them, it always looks darkest just before it gets totally black. So I hope I don't leave you feeling too hopeless. My wife once said that, having listened to me deliver a lecture on another occasion about another subject, but she did say to me afterwards, I think the only response to that is to take paracetamol. I hope you won't feel the same tonight, because I do think there are two reasons for not giving up hope. The first is that, as Pascal Lamy's commission, as the Martin Commission demonstrated, the problems that we face today aren't opaque. They're not insoluble. Ways of solving those problems, practical ways, can be pointed out again and again. We simply need, in order to solve them, to be rather better at breaking the gridlock in our domestic politics, in our domestic political systems, and confronting, among other things, growing hostility to globalization in both the economic sphere and the political sphere. Secondly, in the Atlantic community, I think it's extremely important that we don't, a great act of trahison des clercs, that we don't stop believing in liberal pluralism and in the rule of law. We don't start thinking that there are better ways of running our lives. It's interesting how many of the populist parties in Europe regard Mr. Putin as a hero. We shouldn't think that we have a monopoly of belief in liberal pluralism, and that liberal pluralism doesn't work in other continents or in other societies. That's nonsense. If we want a demonstration of how much nonsense that is, we might look at the streets of a city I know very well, Hong Kong, over the last few weeks, where young men and women who went to universities and read, if they were lucky, Hume and Locke and others, actually believe in liberal pluralism, in democracy and the rule of law, living as they do in a Chinese society, which one day they will run. We don't have to be as brave as some of them are, except, I guess, in an intellectual way. But all of us have a part to play in standing up for our values, a point that I think James Martin would have believed. Well put, of course, in the last sentence, not just paragraph, of the greatest novel in the English language by George Eliot. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistorical acts. Unhistoric, perhaps, but actually acts that recognize that we can ourselves make a contribution to the world being rather better than it is today. After all, the first law of politics is the same as Herb Stein's first law of economics. Things that can't go on forever don't.
Chancellor, thank you so much for what I always feel when I listen to you is a masterclass in how to give a lecture which is both substantive, intellectually, incredibly deep and broad, but also makes common sense and is one that we can all comprehend, which inspires but challenges us very, very deeply, and which is forthright and frank, but still totally intellectually based and even humorous at times, not least on this incredibly difficult and challenging topic of global governance and how to deal with train smashers and gridlock. You didn't, of course, answer the full question. You left it for us to think through what happens when the world fails to learn to cooperate, but you gave us many, many clear hints at that. So thank you. It really is inspiring. I know it's very much in the spirit of what James Martin would have loved to hear on this first memorial lecture. He created the school in order precisely to deal with the nature of these challenges. So we have about half an hour for questions and answers, and please signal. Be aware that this is being filmed, so if you don't want to be filmed, don't speak. Yeah.
From Princeton University, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm a cooperation theorist, but I'm going to ask you a question from the balance of power theory. Balance of power theory has two principles, really. One is that actions that generate threats to others generate counter coalitions, and the other is the enemy of my enemy is, if not my friend, my potential coalition partner. So I have 1 point and one question. The point is, aren't China and Russia, both by violating the basic principle of balance of power theory, generating counter coalitions which will defeat their objectives. And secondly, the second principle, if the Sunni radicalism of ISIS is as serious as many of us seem to think, shouldn't we accommodate with Iran?
First of all, I think that the way China and Russia are or have been behaving is already producing countervailing pressures. Let me take China as the first example. I was with my wife on holiday in Vietnam in February and talking to the Vietnamese about their relationship with China. You don't get the idea that these are communist parties which are understanding one another and working closely together. I find that Indians are increasingly outspoken about their concerns about China, not least with an eye on future potential conflicts over water resources in the Himalayas or over the development of Chinese military power in the oceans around India. Now, I don't think these things are inevitable, and they're not things which I welcome, but that Chinese behavior has produced counter pressures is undoubtedly the case. It's gone right against Deng Xiaoping's advice of hiding your brightness and biding your time, although that's rather a bad translation, I understand, of what he actually said. But in the last few years, and particularly perhaps with this very powerful Chinese leader, China seems to be turning its back on that, and I don't think it's in China's interest. And I just say in parenthesis that I'm certainly one of those who thinks that China doing well is very important to the rest of us. China doing badly would be a disaster. As for Russia, well, Russia may do the impossible and drive Europe into having a single energy policy. It would be a very good thing if that were to happen. I've never agreed with Richard Pearl on very much, but when he said in relation to the first Russian gas which was coming into Europe that this was going to have an awful effect on European foreign policy, I thought he was exaggerating. Well, I think he turned out to be correct. But if Russia's behavior, if the combination of mendacity and bullying which we've seen from Mr. Putin doesn't help to create a European coherence in foreign policy as well as in energy policy, I don't know what will. Should Sunni radicalism in Nineveh and elsewhere make us more sympathetic towards Mr. Netanyahu?
Iran.
Iran. Oh, Iran. Sorry, I thought you said Israel. Sorry. You had me worried for a moment. Iran. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier that I used to be the co-chair of the International Crisis Group, and we, 7-8 years ago, were producing reports about how more sophisticated and intelligent the West should be in trying to deal with Iran's alleged nuclear program and with Iran as a whole. There was a real chance when Khatami and Harazi were in power of moving Iran closer to the West. Iran used to be America's closest ally in the region, and it took a coup in which the Member of Parliament for Oxford, and before he became the Member of Parliament for Oxford, played quite a significant role when he was running the MI6 station in Tehran. It took a coup to actually turn the Iranians off as far as the West was concerned. But if we want to have a coherent and effective anti-proliferation regime, and if we want to involve Iran more closely in dealing with some of the diplomatic problems in the region and political problems, whether Sunni Shia to the west or Afghanistan, then we have to work more closely with Iran. one of the real frustrations of anybody who's ever been there is to know how an extraordinarily sophisticated society has been turned off in part by the way we've dealt with it over the years. Not wholly, but in part by that. When I first went to, when I first went to Tehran and met the president, I was with Mrs. Clegg, as she now is, who was then one of my advisors. And we go in to see her. She's veiled. He won't shake hands with her because she's a woman. So we're slightly nervous about the president's reaction. And he says to us as we're waiting for the meeting to begin, he says, I've just been reading Machiavelli. So he could see body language among some of my colleagues. And he picked this up straight and said, no, he said, not the prince, the discourses. Now, I couldn't at the time think of a single European leader who would have known the distinction between the discourses on living and the prince, and would have known that what he was trying to say to us was he was very interested in how you could develop humanist structures given the theocratic nature of the Iranian state. So I'm a strong believer in trying to reach an agreement with Iran on nuclear issues and making that the basis for going further. I'm puzzled as to why the Germans seem to be so hardline about this. I hope that after the midterm elections, President Obama will see that this is one issue where he can really take a few gambles in foreign policy and simply challenge Congress with executive power. So I hope it's something that happens.
So Ivor.
Well, thank you very much for that encomium of Balliol, which I'm always happy to endorse. You mentioned towards the end that one shouldn't give up hope, but there's one area which, in fact, you were about to touch on, I think, which is the Arab-Israel question. I remember as a young diplomat being told by my then boss, dear boy, he said, you mustn't think there's an answer to the Arab-Israel question. There simply isn't. And it seems to me that was in the 1970s. We're now even further away than we were then from any kind of reasonable outcome. One of the consequences of the Sunni-Shia clash, in a sense, one of the unintended consequences has been to take the pressure off Mr. Netanyahu, who seems to gives every impression of not really being interested in a resolution, seems to have resigned himself to the idea that a political solution doesn't exist. I wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
The Israeli politicians that I know best, people like Shlomo Ben-Ami and Yossi Beilin, are now absolutely pushed off the political map in Israel. And they are, people like them have long argued that unless Israel manages to secure a sustainable agreement with Palestine, with a Palestinian state, it is going to steadily undermine civil liberties, human rights in Israel, and make Israel's position much more difficult both domestically and internationally. It was a point that Jimmy Carter put a few years ago in a book and got heavily criticized for arguing that Israel needs a two-party state settlement just as the Palestinians need it. I read over the summer, which wasn't light reading, an extraordinary book on the history of Israel and the settlements by a historian at, I think he's at King's College London or maybe UCL, called Aaron Bregman. An extraordinary book by a serious Jewish Israeli historian who's of course criticized now as a self-hating Jew because he's written a rather critical book, a very critical book about Israeli policy in the settlements. But it was extraordinary to read an account of how again and again the United States and the rest of us going along with it have been led by the nose in dealing with the issue of settlements. I remember the last time I used to be the president of Medical Aid for Palestinians, which is not a political organisation, it's very much a humanitarian organisation, being astonished at the size of settlements. You think the word suggests a few huts on a hill? I mean, don't believe it. So what I worry about is how possible even now it is to secure a two-state solution. I hope I'm wrong, because a one-state solution is certainly not in Israel's interest, in the interests of the Jewish citizens of Israel. How do we make progress? It demands two things, one of which may seem more implausible than the other. First of all, it demands that the United States should make a distinction between its own national interest and the world's interest, and Mr. Netanyahu's definition of his interest. And secondly, no, not quite as important, that the Europeans should understand that they don't simply have to be led by the nose by the US State Department, and should develop our own view on what's happening in the Middle East. I always took the view that it played into the hands of Likud and right-wing politicians in the United States that Europe would never, ever fail on the whole, I think one or two exceptions, to go along with whatever America advised doing in the United Nations. So we were never prepared to raise the price diplomatically, politically, for the policies that the United States was pursuing. So I'm not very hopeful, but I certainly think that it would be a start if we take a firmer line on settlements, on going back to land for peace, on land swaps, and if we asserted rather more vigorously the importance of protecting human rights and civil liberties. None of that is a pitch for Hamas, though I've actually seen Hamas in operation in the Gaza Strip 3 times as often as Mr. Blair has.
Okay, the gentleman over here and then over there.
Hi, Raj Tani, St. Peter's College. You touched on libertarian interventionism and how that fits with nation rights versus personal rights. And the central thesis of your talk is about cooperation. How do the two sit together?
With considerable difficulty. When the principle of responsibility to protect was first advocated by Kofi Annan, and when it was developed by a committee which was looking at how the UN could be beefed up, and was developed principally, I think, by 2 members of that committee, Gareth Evans, Muddling, and David Hannay, New College, the former extremely distinguished ambassador at the UN. When they developed it, they of course put it in a context which was different from the way some developing countries had seen it after the Iraq intervention, and after the Iraq intervention, which came so closely after Mr. Blair's famous speech in Chicago on humanitarian intervention. Gareth and David and others put it not just in military terms, but in terms of diplomacy, of economic and trade cooperation, of politics more generally. And the UN General Assembly voted on it. I think it was pretty well unanimous. Nothing's ever happened. Gareth, who's written a brilliant book about it, would argue that what happened in Kenya after the elections was an example, with Kofi Annan in the driving seat, was an example of responsibility protect in action. I'm not myself convinced about that. I think it was good old-fashioned diplomacy, but let's pay him the respect of saying that at least it was done once correctly. But ever since then, buyer's remorse has set in. But it does seem to me to be absolutely imperative as a principle to accept that there are implications of individuals having human rights and not just states having human rights. It's a principle which is, of course, was rejected until responsibility to protect came along, and is still rejected today by Mr. Putin, rejected by China and others. It doesn't suggest that when things began to go wrong in Syria, we should have sent in the Grenadier Guards. It does suggest that we could have been much more assertive in what we did at that stage. And would there have been some dangers in that? Probably yes. Is what's happened rather better than having run those risks in the first place? Samantha Power, who is the UN American ambassador, wrote a remarkable book after Rwanda and Bosnia, which was basically arguing never again. But it's never again until we say never again, again. And that's what will happen until we actually find a way in which we can make responsibility to protect work in practice as well as in principle.
Yes. I'm a PhD visiting student from Sciences Po. I'm working on India.
From where, sorry?
From Sciences Po in Paris.
Okay.
I'm working on industrialization in India, and I have two questions on the relationship between India and the Western powers. It relates to climate change and human rights. You said that we should uphold our values, and I totally agree on this. About climate change, India is always referring in international arenas that the Western powers are using the climate change rhetoric to impose its hegemony back. And this goes again to this human rights question and the debate about the supposedly Asian values, because during the summer, the intelligence bureau in India said that social movements that were opposing industrial projects in India were instrumentalized by the Western powers, and we see that the West has refused to engage in business and human rights treaty at the UN. So do you see how the West and emerging powers like India can talk to each other on human rights and climate change without always getting back to national interest and supposedly imperialist ideas?
Look, we reached an agreement with India and China on environmental issues in 1990 with at the London conference on ozone depleting substances, on halons and chlorofluorocarbons, with the ban on those substances, with the West agreeing, in effect the West, agreeing that we were more responsible for what had happened already than were emerging markets, as we then didn't call them, and that therefore we should act more robustly, more quickly than India, China and others, and that we should provide financial assistance and technological transfer in order to help the Indians and Chinese come up to speed. And that negotiation has worked extremely well. We've prevented a really serious problem getting a lot worse. Indeed, we've started to see the repairing of the hole in the ozone layer. So provided there is will on both sides, on our side to recognize that you can't simply look at national statistics, you have to look at per capita statistics, that you can't ignore the extent to which the developed democracies have caused the problem that exists much more than developing than emerging markets have done, and provided that you give some assistance, I think you can make progress on environmental issues in the future. I think in the case of India, India is conflicted. I think it's surprising that India, which has done so extraordinarily well out of global trade, particularly in areas like pharmaceuticals, in car manufacture, in back office activities. I think it's surprising that India is still so reluctant to accept further trade liberalization on other matters as well. And I think that's a real mistake on the part of the Indians. I've had lots of arguments with India, which I rather agree with Ramachandra Guha that it's the most interesting country in the world. I've had lots of arguments with Indian politicians about trade, about environmental policy. I've never had one which sought to link alleged colonialist attitudes to human rights with those things. So I don't think that's a really big issue. As for Asian values, how could you be an Indian and argue that there was something called Asian values? India is a democracy. China is not a democracy. Singapore is somewhere between the two. They're all Asian societies. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, all Asian societies, but there isn't one political, cultural model which suits them all, which fits them all.
I'm afraid we only have time for one more quick question, and we're going to have to have a quick response as well. Not you, the lady behind you. I think we have to have at least one woman ask a question.
Yes, Elizabeth Roberts. One area you didn't touch on in your survey of world problems, or didn't touch on very closely, was the Maghreb and North Africa, which is particularly close to us in Europe. And I wondered, it seems to me that it's a situation which has become more insecure after our intervention in Libya, with the spillover into Mali and possible link-ups following with Boko Haram and right across the Nilotic region of Africa. I wonder whether you think that the approach being taken by the French, which seems to be a rather unilateral approach to dealing with insecurity or trying to tackle this, is a productive one, or whether there is some other way that we should be looking at this particular challenge, or whether it's just something we can't sensibly do anything about.
Well, I'll tell you one aspect of the French attitude to the Maghreb which used to cause me a good deal of annoyance, and I say this, I'm afraid, even in the presence of a distinguished graduate of Sciences Po. When I was European Commissioner for External Affairs, I used to be required to go around the Mediterranean negotiating trade and cooperation agreements with partners around the littoral as part of the so-called Barcelona process. And all those agreements were required to have a human rights clause. And I would be pressed by members of the mother of parliaments, the European parliaments, to make sure that there was a robust human rights clause. Now, what did I discover? First of all, that when you try to apply the human rights clause, for example, in Tunisia, the first thing you would have is a phone call from the Elysee Palace telling you not to be so ridiculous. The president of Tunisia was a great friend, pettifogging junior bureaucrats like me shouldn't get involved in these great diplomatic issues. Secondly, and this came to me rather later in the day, what I discovered after I'd been a European Commissioner was that a lot of the countries where we were sending people under the terms of extraordinary rendition, presumably expecting them to have the truth, quote unquote, tortured out of them by the security services in those regimes, were exactly the same countries that I'd been required to negotiate tough human rights clauses with when I was a European Commissioner. So I think there is a fault line which has run through our attitudes to the relationship between economics, trade, and human rights. We spent a fortune in the Mediterranean on trying to sustain rule of law, to build economic and political institutions, and it wasn't, frankly, hugely successful. One of the things which I think went badly wrong was that we were never very serious about the trade aspect of those agreements. So that, first of all, there is very little intra-regional trade between Maghreb countries, certainly Maghreb and Mashreq. Secondly, we got into the situation where we were blocking the export of goods from the Maghreb to southern Europe. In order to grow or produce those things ourselves in southern Europe, when it was cheaper to produce them in the Maghreb, and when in order to pick the olives or pick the oranges or whatever in southern Europe, we were having to use illegal migrants from North Africa. It was complete nonsense. It was complete lunacy. So I think that in order to have a rather more effective policy in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, and elsewhere, we should be much more open to trade with those countries. We should be much more resourceful in the way we use our considerable financial clout, and we should be tougher when we put conditionality on things in actually making that conditionality work. Whether that would have prevented the reversals that have taken place in some countries, not Tunisia, but some others, I can't say, but it certainly would have been a more rational way of developing our policies. I think it's extraordinary, given our proximity to those countries, given the impact that immigration from those countries is going to have on the rest of Europe, that we've played such a small role in the geostrategy of the region, that we haven't been as important or more important than America in some of those countries, and it's our own wretched fault.
Chancellor, thank you so much. Just before we thank you, I do want to draw your attention to some of the forthcoming events here. You might not have realized it, Chancellor, but you're actually the warm-up act for the director, Kate Allen of Amnesty International, that's speaking in this room at 7:30 this evening. So for those of you that want to stay to hear Kate on Amnesty International and human rights, please do so. Next Monday, the 3rd of November, we have Professor Wolfgang Lutz, who's the founding director of the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Human Capital, talking about world population growth, education, and what's likely to happen over the coming decades. I would highly recommend it, followed by a panel discussion with many of the Oxford experts in this area. Then on the following Monday, if you want to hear my take on globalization and systemic risk, the butterfly defect, I will be here at the same time. And on the 18th of November, we have a panel discussion on Is the Planet Full? So just some sense of the things coming, and of course our regular Thursday seminars at 3:30, the next one being David Clifton on the next generation of mobile health. The series is on the health challenges of the 21st century. I also would encourage you to look at the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations report that the Chancellor referred to now for the long term. We've had 1.2 million downloads, so we can try and aspire to even more. But it does provide some sense of how we can practically deal with these many challenges that the Chancellor was referring to. Chancellor, you've done an absolutely extraordinary job in going to, I think, all the critical hotspots of the world. It might not have left us feeling more optimistic, but it certainly, I think, left us a huge amount wiser and better understanding the background, and we've been to many of these places before. And also, I hope, inspired us to not only learn more, but do more to resolve these challenges. So thank you, Chancellor.